to our last presentation, but thank you again so much. So our last presentation of the session is by Joseph Maimone from Massachusetts General Hospital, and he'll tell us about a systematic review on practices for monitoring and responding incoming data on self-injurious thoughts and behaviors.
So thank you guys so much for, I'm so honored to be included in this group. This has been a wonderful series of talks. So yeah, my name is Joseph Maimone. I'm a research assistant in Matthew Nock's lab at Harvard and Massachusetts General Hospital. And today I'd like to share with you the results of my and my co-authors' work on how to handle and the data that is being received in real-time studies of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So I have no financial disclosures to disclose. So today I want to provide a brief background on the importance of this topic, walk you through the process of how that we followed for this review, show you a few of our key findings and discuss the important insights that we came to, and then finally end on a quick summary of our ideas and future work. So it won't be a surprise to anybody here that despite decades of research, we are still not yet able to accurately predict and prevent the onset or escalation of suicidal and non-suicidal self-injurious thoughts or behaviors. Henceforth, I will refer to these as SIPBs. But real-time monitoring methods have facilitated natural observations of SIPBs. And with recent advances in mobile technologies, these methods have become more feasible. So the result is that there has been an exponential rise in real-time monitoring studies within the past few years, especially. That said, not without significant practical and ethical considerations. So I'd like you to consider the following scenarios in which the research team conducting these studies is receiving information in real time or very close to it, where a participant says something like, I'm going to kill myself today. So in this example, they're expressing clear thoughts of suicide as well as intent to act on them. Or I want to kill myself, but I don't have a plan. Again, there are clearly expressed suicidal thoughts, but in this case, it's unclear how at risk this participant may really be. And finally, an example, I want to hurt myself, but I don't want to die. In this case, at least some desire to harm oneself. And in this specific moment, no expressed suicidal thoughts, but again, unclear how at risk they really are. So given that the team is receiving this information approximately in real time, what are they obligated to do, if anything? What would a possible intervention look like? For example, do they send an ambulance, call the participant, perhaps an emergency contact, maybe do nothing? What about the specifics of the study? How might an intervention differ for a sample of adolescents compared to adults? And could intervening lead the participant to change their responses in the future or potentially stop responding to avoid an unwanted intervention, in which case we're not even detecting the safety risks? The final point is critical because it means intervening may make it all the more difficult for us to observe and ultimately better understand these phenomena we are trying to predict and prevent. So building on a recent review actually conducted by Dr. Bai, one of the other panelists here, of 6 adolescent studies that was published earlier this year, we set out to expand on that and build out a review of all studies across all populations to understand how exactly researchers are designing their studies to handle these practical and ethical challenges. And ultimately, the goal of our review is to contribute to best guidelines for researchers conducting this research, as well as key stakeholders such as IRB officials who may lack understanding or awareness or familiarity with these methods, as well as grant funders who may review such protocols. So to assess this question, we systematically identified relevant studies using the following 3 criteria. So did the study assess suicidal or non-suicidal SIPBs using technology that allowed for at least a daily assessment of these variables? And upon completion of our systematic review, we identified 105 published works and 35 active grants which met our inclusion criteria. And across these, we identified 66 unique protocols to include in our analysis. We began by systematically extracting data from publications as well as the grant details for the included studies. And then we used a structured data collection form to gather information on the study design. So age and size of the sample, length of the study, the technology that the study used, as well as risk monitoring procedures that the authors and principal investigators used. This step helped us to ensure we had a complete set of data on these protocols, which are often not published. Ultimately, we only included data for which authors and principal investigators responded, and we had a pretty good response rate. I think 60 to 70% of authors responded. We saw a lot of variety in the study designs across our sample. So interestingly, we saw an even three-way split in the types of CITES that the studies assessed. And you can also see there are various technologies in this data set reflective of some of the earlier study designs before smartphones became so popular. We also saw great variety in the thresholds that researchers used in their risk monitoring protocols. This first plot shows the distribution of criteria used to define high risk across the included studies. And I'd like to take a look at the most popular threshold, severe intent, where 35% of the studies would consider a real-time response from a participant saying something like, "I am definitely going to kill myself today," as a sufficient criterion to trigger follow-up procedures such as a call from the study team to conduct a risk assessment with the participant. By comparison, this second plot shows the criteria used for triggering automatic pop-up messages. The most salient criteria in this plot, suicidal ideation, indicates a slightly lower threshold of symptom severity than in the first plot to trigger resources. And here is an example of a possible pop-up message like the ones in our data set. And they typically contain empathic urging to stay safe, as well as some resources such as a hotline number, a personalized number to the participant's clinician as an example, a safety plan, among other potential resources. When looking at risk monitoring practices, we saw that studies were evenly divided between choosing to monitor and provide resources and not doing so. And these practices were dependent on the design of the study. So, for example, none of the studies that only collected data on non-suicidal self-injury, NSSI on bottom of this plot, none of them provided pop-up resources. The studies that collected real-time data on suicidal ideation and suicide attempts, the top two in this plot, did show a clear preference for monitoring the data during active data collection. When considering the age of participants, protocols involving adolescents exhibit more active pop-up use and monitoring activities compared to studies of adults. And the size of the study also showed a difference. So studies larger than 100 participants, the bottom of these two plots that I'll show you, showed that they were inclined not to provide pop-up resources as often, but did practice more active data monitoring compared to studies with fewer participants, although this could be explained by differences in funding and other resources. So I'd like to take a moment to compare some of our findings to a recent consensus statement also published by our lab on the ethical and safety practices of studying suicidal thoughts and behaviors in real time. So I discussed earlier that studies in our data are divided on their use of things such as a pop-up resource. And this lack of clear agreement on when to use pop-up resources actually aligns with what is reported in the consensus statement. So that was helpful to see in our data. We also saw in our data that a significant proportion of studies did not monitor or respond to CITB data. So 40% of studies did not do this. This is actually a deviation from the published consensus, expert consensus, where we saw about 90% of experts agreed that the data should be reviewed and responded to as soon as possible. It is important to note, however, that recent advances in technology have made it significantly more possible and easier to respond to high-risk responses in real time. So therefore, this lack of agreement may be partially due to studies included in our sample using earlier technologies. Regardless, these findings highlight need for further agreement on when to use these practices. I also want to highlight that it is appropriate for some study designs not to monitor CITB data, such as studies that enroll participants anonymously and therefore have none of the requisite information to reach out to and respond to these participants, or who lack the necessary resources to monitor and respond to high-risk responses. such as studies that are perhaps being conducted by graduate students or without much funding. I'd also like to return to my earlier question about whether monitoring SITB data and intervening skews the data. The short answer is we don't know. And so far, these concerns are mostly speculative. As a result, though, we emphasize a need for further research to test different risk monitoring practices and their impact on participant data as well as participant safety. I'd like to highlight a few limitations in this work, namely the fact that we only included data of studies for which authors responded to us. So that introduces potential bias in our data. And also that current grants we included were restricted by only 2 funding sources. That said, real-time data collection holds great promise for furthering our understanding of suicidal and non-suicidal SITBs. I think that's pretty widely believed across the field. The fact that as a field, our current practices are not standardized and their impact on participants and their data is not well understood does demonstrate, however, a great opportunity to conduct further research and begin to fill these gaps in our knowledge. So that's the conclusion. And I wanted to have an expression of great gratitude for all of my co-authors and mentors, as well as all of the authors and principal investigators who responded to our request for data. So thank you all so much for the time. And now hopefully we can open it up for some questions.
I guess one question we could ask as a start is, you said that this is a gap and an opportunity because there isn't the kind of standardization that maybe we would want. What do you see as the next step or how we might start to address that?
Yeah, I think that a critical approach that will help significantly is a method that's kind of newly in developing called micro-randomization trials. So because we have these studies are longitudinal and we're measuring these data at multiple time points per day, there are multiple opportunities that a participant may indicate a high risk response, and therefore multiple opportunities for us to provide a resource. And so a study whose design randomly assigns a resource each time that a high risk response comes through will allow us to compare the impact of those results on the data of the participant themselves and also across participants. So this is, I think, one potentially powerful way for us to gain the requisite insight to understand what is the impact on their safety and also what is the impact on their data and their willingness to engage in the study beyond the point at which we intervene.
Really interesting to see how that area progresses, I guess, over time. Any other questions, either from the panelists, from any of the attendees?